This is part 102 on chapter 26, and this is on environmental microbiology, or kind of the ecology part of the microbiology. So I included this chapter into this unit because it kind of goes along with chapters 7 and 8. We're going to be talking about some microorganism relationships again, and then how these microorganisms and their nutrition and their metabolism fit into the bigger picture of the ecology, or all the interactions of organisms with each other and their environment. So ecology, it's looking at the interconnecting web of life, so how organisms interact with each other and, like I said, with their environment as well. So microbial ecology specifically is looking at how microbes interact with their natural habitats and interact with each other. Some of this ecology stuff we can turn into applied microbiology. So this is where we use information and we take that and we study it for practical uses. And these include food processing, industrial production, and biotechnology. So applied microbiology is using what we know about microbes in their natural habitat and applying it to something that humans can use to do these different things. So in ecology, everything's split up into two categories. So there's the biotic part of ecology. These are looking at the living or once living components. So those are the things that have cells or the waste from these cells and these organisms. The other side of ecology is the abiotic, and this is the non-living component. This includes like the rocks, water, the inorganic elements like phosphorus, and kind of like the carbon. So all of the non-living parts that still work with the living things. So that's the ecology part, how organisms interact with each other and their environment or the non-living things. So in our ecosystem, we have this organization. So the biosphere includes every place that has life in it. So it includes a thin envelope of life that surrounds the Earth's surface. And this includes the atmosphere, so the gas, it includes the water, it includes the land. So you have the water part, which is called the hydrosphere. So hydro is water. The lithosphere is the soil part or the land part. And then the atmosphere includes the air that surrounds the whole Earth. And these are these different places that life can exist. And this is just showing, up at the top we have our biosphere, which has our lithosphere, hydrosphere, and the atmosphere to it. In the biosphere we have what are called biomes. So we're just separating the biosphere into different groups, smaller groups. And biomes include, there's examples up here, but like a tropical rainforest, a temperate forest, a taiga, tundra. We live in a grassland prairie, so that's the biome we have. These biomes are then divided into ecosystems, and then ecosystems include all of the living and non-living things. So ecosystems include all the biotic and the non-biotic or abiotic things. Those ecosystems, we can divide them into communities, and communities only include the biotic things, and they only include the living things. So ecosystems and communities, it's important that you know the difference between those. It's probably going to be on the exam. So again, ecosystems include all the living and non-living things in an area. Community only includes the living things in that area. Those communities we then can divide into populations. And the population is just the number of the same species in an area. And then you have individual organisms. So we kind of go up if you think of this in relation to humans, for example. So each of you are an individual organism. And then if you look at the population of Colby, so you count the number of humans that live in the area defined as Colby. And then if you look at the community of Colby, it includes the humans, it includes all the dogs and the squirrels and the trees and anything that's living. The ecosystem of Colby, Kansas, would be all of those living things, so all the humans and the dogs and the trees and the squirrels, plus any water features and the rocks and the atmosphere. So that's kind of an example of this. In these ecosystems, so at the lowest level, looking at the ecosystem or the community or even populations, every organism has what's called a habitat. And a habitat, this is the physical location in that environment in which the organism has adapted. So think of the habitat as like the house for the organism. In addition to that physical location, or where the organism actually lives, physically lives, every organism or species also has a niche or a niche. So the niche is the overall role. It's kind of like the job that that individual has in the community, or that species has in the community. And there's different jobs or roles, so it could be a nutritional intake job, it could be their position in the community, if they're, for example, a predator, or if they're a prey, or if they're a parasite. You can also define this as their rate of population growth, so if they grow really fast, or if they grow slow, if that species is involved in some type of chemical cycle, that could also be their role. So their role can be very diverse within that community. So one of the niches that we look at a lot is the nutritional one. And this relates back to energy as well. So there are, in a community or in an ecosystem, some organisms will be considered to be heterotrophs. And you can also look back at chapter 7 to kind of review some of these terms as well. So a heterotroph, they are organisms that get their carbon from an organic source. So if you remember that nutritional, so for example, humans, we talked about we're chemoheterotrophs. We have to get our energy from chemicals, and we also have to get our carbon from an organic chemical. So heterotrophs are an important part of an ecosystem. Some of these heterotrophs we talked were decomposers, so they decompose things like the saprobes, like fungi or bacteria. Other organisms are considered to be consumers, where they physically eat other living organisms. And then we also have the autotrophs. So autotrophs is where they get their carbon from an inorganic source. Probably the most common autotrophs are the photoautotrophs, where they get their energy from sunlight and then they use carbon dioxide to get their carbon. So that's the photoautotroph again. Remember, you can go back to chapter 7. We talked about the different nutritional categories in that chapter. So this energy or nutrient flow, so everything, all the energy comes from the sun. And this is actually going from the bottom. So we have our energy source, which we're going to say is the sun for now, but you can also have other energy sources. You have carbon dioxide as your inorganic carbon source. So your producers, or your autotrophs, they take that, they can produce more food, they produce their own food, and those are usually primary producers. These primary producers are consumed by primary consumers. They're secondary consumers, tertiary, and sometimes quaternary consumers. And all of these consumers and the producers, they generate waste, they also die, and that's where the decomposers come into play. So these decomposers can then break down that waste or break down these dead or dying other living organisms up at the top, up here. And this is how nutrition flows through the ecosystem. It's also how energy can flow through an ecosystem from one organism to another. So sometimes we will actually represent this as what's called a food web. So here is a food web. We have our sun way at the bottom. Then we have algae. And algae are a type of photoautotrophs, so they use the sun and they use carbon dioxide to generate their own food. And then these algae are consumed by different primary consumers. Those primary consumers can be consumed by secondary consumers or tertiary consumers. And it usually isn't a straight line or a food chain that you may have heard of. A lot of times we have these more complex food webs, like the one shown here in this picture. Another part of this chapter looks at ecological interactions, and we already talked about these in detail in chapter 7, so I'll quickly go over it. So microorganisms have different associations with each other. Some of these are symbiotic relationships where the organisms have to live in close relationships, and this relationship is required by at least one of the members. We talked about mutualism, where in this relationship both members benefit, commensalism, where one member benefits, the other doesn't really care, and then parasitism, where one member benefits and the other is harmed. So again, go back to chapter 7 to kind of review these. And then very quickly, non-symbiotic associations. These organisms, they can form relationships, but it's not required for those organisms in order to live. So synergism is a good relationship. They're helping each other, but again, they don't have to have it. It's good if it happens. Antagonism, that's the bad relationship, where they're actually harming each other, or one organism's going to harm the other one. So remember, again, like I said already, you can go back and review that. Okay, so in our biosphere, some organisms are responsible for recycling different nutrients. So essential elements are cycled through biological, geological, and chemical parts. And this is called a biogeochemical cycle. So biogeochemical cycle, you have to look at biology, geology, and chemistry in order to understand these different cycles. And microorganisms, they remove elements from their inorganic reservoirs, and convey them into the food web. So this is where microorganisms, they can bring a certain element like carbon from the inorganic source, from carbon dioxide, and then the autotrophs will take that inorganic carbon dioxide, they'll turn it into a usable form, so they'll convey it into the food web, and then other microorganisms or other organisms can use that carbon later on. So this is kind of a cycle. And then once those organisms die, that carbon will get decomposed back into the inorganic form. So you're having this cycling of different elements. In our biogeochemical cycles, there's the atmospheric cycle, like the carbon cycle, which I just kind of went over very briefly. There's also a nitrogen cycle. Sedimentary cycles include phosphorus and sulfur. So again, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, there's organisms that will convert it from an inorganic form into an organic form. That organic form can be used in the ecosystem, and then eventually it's going to return back into the inorganic form. So inorganic to organic, back to inorganic. So that's how it's cycling through. This is the carbon cycle. Let's see, where should I start? Alright, so up at the top we have free carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So we have that inorganic form just in the air. This inorganic carbon dioxide, if you look at the green arrow on the right, it gets taken in by photosynthetic organisms like plants, algae, or cyanobacteria. That inorganic carbon dioxide gets fixed into organic carbon in the form of glucose. That glucose then can be consumed by primary consumers and secondary consumers. When that plant or algae or cyanobacteria dies, then the inorganic carbon will be decomposed by fungi or bacteria, which is on the left. Okay. So we start off with inorganic carbon dioxide. It got turned into organic carbon molecules. And then that organic carbon molecule can be used, then it can be decomposed back into inorganic. We also get inorganic carbon dioxide from volcanoes, industrial pollution, so those are other sources. And then of course all these organisms are going to respire out carbon dioxide during cellular respiration. So if you kind of look at this, you can kind of see the cycle where it starts up at the top. There's an arrow going down, arrows going around the bottom, and then they go back up. So that's the carbon cycle. The nitrogen cycle is kind of similar. This one involves several types of different microorganisms. So up at the top we have atmospheric nitrogen gas. We have this inorganic nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. That inorganic nitrogen, the first step is that it goes through nitrogen fixation. So we're starting at the top and we're going to the right again. So we have certain organisms that will fix the nitrogen into a usable form for organisms. That usable form can go through ammonification, or gets turned into ammonia. We have nitrification by plants, algae, and other bacteria that they can use. And then eventually there are organisms that will denitrify the nitrogen and turn it back into atmospheric form. So we're going to go from a non-usable form in the atmosphere. Some organisms turn it into a usable form. It can flow through the food web, and then it gets turned back into an unusable form. So again, we just have this cycle that's going around. So nitrogen fixation is pretty cool. So we have these certain organisms that can take unusable energy and fix it into a usable form. So one place where these organisms are found are root nodules. And this is a type of symbiotic relationship between Rhizobia, which is a bacteria, and a legume, which is a type of plant. So what happens is this bacteria, it actually lives inside the nodules of the plant up here. So this bacteria is going to fix the nitrogen for the plant, and the plant allows the bacteria a little house or nodule to live in. So it's actually a mutualistic symbiotic relationship. So your bacteria goes into the plant root, the legume root. It grows into the root and it can flow through the different cells of the plant. And while it's in there, again, it fixes nitrogen into a usable form that the plant can use to grow. The phosphorous cycle is a type of sedimentary cycle. It's kind of just the same idea here, and you don't need to know details of these. Just kind of generally what they are. So in this, instead of the phosphorus being in the air, it's in rocks. So that's why it's a sedimentary cycle. So in the rocks we have this phosphorus element. The rocks get weathered down. It goes into the soil. The plants take up the phosphate. It's in the plants. The animals eat the plants, so the animals get it. The animals produce waste or they die, so it goes back into the soil or the rocks. So instead of going in and out of the air, it's going in and out of the soil. During these cycles, you can have the introduction of toxic substances. Some of the toxins will be converted into less harmful substances, so they're fine, they're taken care of. But other toxins can be persistent and they can flow through the biosphere and actually cause problems in organisms. So classic example of a toxic substance is mercury. So mercury, a little bit of the mercury goes into the water, it gets into the algae or other small organisms, and then larger organisms eat these smaller organisms, and eventually, because organisms can't break down mercury, they can't convert it into a less harmful substance, this mercury is going to accumulate in the higher levels of the food chain or the food web. And this is called bioaccumulation. So this is when a pollutant like mercury is accumulated by living things through the natural trophic flow of the ecosystem. So basically, if the little guys in the food web get a little bit of mercury in them, the larger guys eat a lot of the little guys, so those larger guys get even more mercury in them because it just kind of builds up in the tissues of the living organism. And eventually when you get to the higher level fish like the salmon or the tuna that are at the really high level of the ecosystem, they're at the very top of the food chain, they have a lot of this toxin built up into their tissues. And that's that bioaccumulation